Hello to our audiences from around the world. I'm Kate Seeley, Vice President for Arts and Culture at the Middle East Institute, and I want to welcome you to our first artist panel discussing our latest exhibit, Converging Lines, Tracing the Artistic Lineage of the Arab Diaspora in the US. The show opened on September 10th with an in-gallery curator tour with Maymanah Farhat, which you can find on the MEI website on our Arts and Culture page. There you can also find a link to a digital version of the show. Now, the exhibit is up through November 17th. Please come see it in person if you can. And if you happen to be free this Saturday night, the gallery is open from 6 p.m. to midnight as part of Art All Night, a DC-wide cultural celebration, so spread the word. Today, we're delighted to welcome 3 of the show's 17 artists and the curator for a discussion exploring their vision, their practice, their influences, and the question of cultural hybridity, which is so central to their work and to the thematics linking the works in the exhibit. Now, for those of you who have not had a chance to see it, it is a very rich show. It features 17 Arab American and Arab diaspora artists whose work spans many decades and many styles. And we even have a Khalil Gibran illustration dating back to 1919 in a nod to the first recognized Arab American artist. Now, Maymanah Farhat, the curator, will speak about the vision for the show, but I just want to note that for MEI, we're just very proud to host a show that highlights just how significant the role of Arab American artists has been in American art history. And we believe the show serves as a valuable record of their largely under-recognized role and contributions to the American art scene. So a big thanks to Maymanah for curating such a visually compelling and impactful show. And of course, many, many thanks to our 3 artists, some of Shaibi, Sherin, Guirguis, and Jacqueline, Reem, Salloum, for lending their works to the show and also lending their insights to this discussion today. So thank you all so, so much. Now, they're going to be in discussion for the next hour with the director of our Arts and Culture Center, Lynn Snej. She played a huge role in making this exhibit happen, so a shout out to Lynn. Lynn has over 20 years of experience in cultural development in the Middle East. She's a Salzburg Global Seminar Fellow, a nominator to the Aga Khan Music Awards, and an advisor to museums and art NGOs in the Middle East. So thank you, Lynn, for shepherding this discussion. But before I hand it over to you, just a few quick housekeeping notes. For those of you on Zoom, to submit your questions virtually, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone and watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And if you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. So thank you. And now, Lynn, I'd like to hand the show over to you.
Thank you, Kate. I want to welcome our stellar panelists who have joined us today for what promises to be a great conversation about their artistic practice and the thematics that drive their vision, and how straddling many cultures, moving countries and continents has impacted their work. We will also discuss how this rich cultural hybridity they bring to the table might be better recognized as being part of the American art scene, and how it can be used to enrich and bind rather than separate and pigeonhole. Here to talk about these issues are 4 accomplished artists who straddle many cultures and whose experiences of this in-betweenness that often accompanies migration continue to shape their work and message. I'm going to introduce them very briefly alphabetically. You can see their full bios on our website. We are joined by Sama Al-Shaibi. Sama is a conceptual artist based in Arizona, whose photographs and videos situate her own body as a site of performance in consideration of the social and gendered impacts of war and migration. Al-Shaibi was named a Guggenheim Fellow in Photography in 2021. Maymanah Farhat's art historical research and curatorial work focus on underrepresented artists and forgotten art scenes. Since 2005, she has written widely on 20th and 21st century art, contributing essays and chapters to edited volumes, museums, and gallery catalogs. Farhat has also curated exhibitions throughout the US and abroad. Sherin Guirguis is based in LA and uses sight, text, and recovered histories to engage audiences in a dialogue about power, agency, and social transformation through art. Her research-based practice seeks to heighten the understanding of marginalized and contested histories, in particular, those of women that have often been forgotten and or erased. Jacqueline Salloum is an artist and a filmmaker whose pop-infused work draws on her Palestinian and Syrian roots. Her multimedia-based artwork focuses on documenting histories and memories of people, including her family, that have been fragmented by displacement and exile. With that, I would like to get right into our conversation today, and I'm going to first turn to you, Maymanah. Can you bring the show that you so beautifully curated to life for our audiences? What is the show about? How many artists and artworks are included? And what are the thematic threads that weave the works together? We're going to pull up a PowerPoint to share with our audience so that Maymanah can sort of start her framing of the show and take us through it and highlight a few pieces in the show. Over to you, Maymanah.
Great, thank you, Reem. Thank you to the artists for joining us today. I know everyone's really busy, so I appreciate you giving us our time, your time, I'm sorry. The show is basically a culmination of my research in Arab and Arab American artists' work over the past 15 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of the discourse kind of change in terms of American art history and it opening up, but it seems to me that Arab American art scenes and artists have kind of been pushed to the side and haven't really been incorporated into the American art historical canon. So this show is just kind of a bold sort of attempt at affirming our presence and affirming the fact that we've been contributing to this art scene for over 100 years. And by way of looking at different kind of highlights or different artists over the last 100 years and seeing how aesthetics have evolved, how concerns have changed, how themes have emerged or been consistent. So it's a way of bringing together 17 very diverse artists. And really unfortunately, it only offers a glimpse into this very expansive, very rich art scene. But I hope to continue building on the subject matter and to, going forward to curate other shows that might highlight this very diverse group of artists. So if we start with the slides, we basically kind of divided the show into three different generations what I like to call sort of clusters of artists. So we start with Khalil Gibran, who's kind of the anchor of the show because he is one of the first visual artists and writers to identify as Arab American. He was very active in the New York art scene, very, very active in the literary scene more broadly, and really kind of pushed this identity and encouraged other Arab American artists to identify as such and to form, this new kind of community. So we start with him, but the first cluster is basically an older generation of artists that were practicing in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth. But really the start of their artistic practices began in the 50s and 60s. So for example, we're looking at a painting by Farhat Khalan, who's an artist who was born and raised in Beirut, had a studio in the 1960s there, was very active, left for Paris, and then eventually settled in Los Angeles. And so what I love about Farhat's work is that it kind of straddles these three different worlds. You can definitely see the influence of the Parisian art scene on this piece here that she created in 1973, but she's very Beiruti and in terms of her biography and her involvement. The circles that she ran in Beirut were very significant to the art scene during the 1960s. And then she settles in Los Angeles in the 90s and becomes very much part of a dynamic art scene that was active around Venice Beach. So we might think the Light and Space movement with James Turrell, who had a studio in Venice Beach. She was friends with Ed Moses, James Hayward, all these different sort of very important California artists. So when I look at this work, I definitely think Beirut. I know that it was created in Paris, but then I can't help but also associate her with Los Angeles because she was so much a core member of that artistic circle there. And this is a theme that kind of carries throughout the exhibition in terms of really sort of situating Arab and Arab American artists within specific American art scenes. And I think that the work often reflects that. So if we can go to the next slide. This is a piece by Helen Khal. She's a Lebanese American artist born in Pennsylvania. She travels to Beirut in the 1940s to go to art school and never leaves. She meets the poet Yusuf Khal, they marry, and in the early 1960s, they open Gallery One, one of the first galleries in Lebanon for contemporary art. And Helen is very involved. She actually shares a studio with Fouad Kalan in the 60s before Fouad goes to Paris, and starts writing mostly in English for local newspapers and becomes a very important art critic in the Lebanese scene. And she stays there until the end of her life. She has a penthouse apartment on top of the YWCA that overlooks the sea, and she paints these types of works for years and years and years. So Helen is a great example too of that like kind of reverse migration in terms of artists who have shuttled back and forth between the US and the Arab world, which we see a lot of now. And so I loved including her work alongside Fouad's because I like that connection, that deep sort of bond that they had.
We can go to the next slide, yes.
So our second cluster of artists is basically what we might call in the art world mid-career. So this is an artist, a Palestinian artist who was born in Egypt named John Halaka. He's been based in San Diego for a very long time. He teaches there. And a lot of his work addresses the Palestinian issue. So if we look at this piece, which looks, just like a landscape from afar, I don't think we don't have a close-up, Lean?
We don't.
Oh, that's okay.
But maybe you can talk about what people will see as they
For sure.
close.
For sure. I wanted to include this piece just to kind of highlight the intensity of the political commitment that artists from this specific community often carry. Arab American artists are very committed in their work. And so for someone like John, we might have an image here of an abandoned Palestinian home in the West Bank. But then if you look closely, he's covered it in a stamp that says resist. And so here it's a way of bringing in the viewer to this landscape, kind of grabbing their attention, and then making a bold kind of political statement. And a lot of times you see the Arab American artists use these very interesting sort of aesthetic ways of drawing in the viewer and bringing them into the work. And then in order to kind of have like a conversation about these certain political issues. This is a work by Helen Zoureib, an artist who was born in Beirut, left with the start of the Lebanese Civil War, and then eventually settled in the US. Helen created this piece in 2010 when she was about to have a show at Ajal Gallery in Beirut, which is owned by Saleh Barakat and a very important gallery in the Lebanese art scene. And it was Helen's kind of homecoming. It was the first time that she returned to Lebanon after being displaced in 1975. And so again, we don't have a close-up, but you can kind of see that it's, this line work that goes in a circular kind of form. And the line work is actually made up of the Arabic word that says bait, which is home. So here, Helen is kind of meditating on this idea that she's returning to Beirut for the first time, and she's been displaced, for over 25 years at that point. And she's thinking about, what that means in terms of her own sort of life and the sort of milestone for her that is about to take place. So it's a very kind of methodical piece. It's a very introspective piece, but I think it's a piece that many of us can relate to. It's an artist by the name of Mohammed Omar Khalil. He's a Sudanese artist who's been based in New York for a very long time. What I loved about including his work is we see the influence of printmaking on his paintings. He's a master printmaker, widely known for his prints in the New York art scene. But then also he's very much employing this kind of like New York sort of aesthetic. So we might think of Rauschenberg, we might think of Jasper Johns, and Muhammad has been there the whole time. So he's involved in these scenes, he's involved in these artistic movements, and he's bringing everything together.
Thank you, Maymanah, for this. Can you talk a little bit about the themes, the themes that bind the works, obviously from your presentation, but the theme of exile, of home, and maybe some of the younger generation sort of work that we haven't seen?
Definitely. I think that one of the threads that we can see throughout is very strong aesthetic experimentation and a mastery of forms. But also we see themes like issues of migration, issues of displacement. War tends to creep in certain works. Also this sense of in-betweenness. There was a great show that just took place in LA that's a little off topic, but it was titled Not From Here, Not From There. And I feel like that just kind of like, summarizes the experiences that so many of us have, being first, second, third generation immigrants. And so I think a lot of these kinds of themes show up in the work here. And what I love about the diversity of the show is that it really shows that it's an American show first and foremost, because these kinds of themes and these subject matters are not exclusive to Arab and Arab American artists. These are things that so many artists in the US have been exploring for quite a long time. So it's another way of sort of situating them within that art historical canon and really kind of confirming and affirming the fact that, these are American themes first and foremost.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out, because that is what we are going to sort of discuss in a bit more detail in our conversation. I want to turn to our artist. I want to first turn to Sherin. Your work engages with social structures, cultural identity, and women's agency, and you use ornamentation, pattern, and geometry to speak about those issues. So Sherin, we're going to put up your work. We would love that you sort of take us through the work, and from there, talk to us a bit more broadly about your practice and some of the themes that drive your vision.
Thank you, Maymanah and Lynn. It's really quite an honor to be in the show, and I really appreciate the context that you've created around this discussion, because that it's often neglected and missing from a lot of conversation around exhibitions like this that use geography or cultural identification to frame shows, and then what ends up happening is that becomes the only point of discussion. So it was really great to hear you walk through the show, Maymanah, and really expand on your vision of how a lot of this work really fits into the context of a larger American contemporary art, for me, contemporary art practices. So this piece that's in the exhibition is actually quite an old piece, and I'm glad that this is the one that we're good to talk about, because my practice really emerged from my experience of immigrating here when I was 14 to Los Angeles, and as I started to make work as an artist there, trying to root myself in the LA art scene, but also what that means for me as a woman of Arab descent, as an Egyptian, and going through grad school, coming out of grad school, that whole kind of grind. So thinking about what are the big questions that I was going to kind of root my practice in, and it really around 2001, the world was changing for Arab Americans, truly. The way that we became from invisible to visible, and then visible within this context that we can't really frame or control, and entirely biased. And so I decided at that moment, even though I had been studying a lot of light and space artists, I was looking at a lot of people like Huguette and that was the kind of work I was making. I realized that immediately I had to give myself permission to use some of the visual language that I grew up with, just as a tool for me to try to come up with the questions and frame my practice around what does that hybridity mean? What does that in-betweenness? And I use that word all the time too, because it's really that liminal space that we occupy. And so what does it mean to have to put these sometimes kind of polarized identities together and experiences together? So I started pulling from the kind of painting I was doing that really was rooted in California, LA, color field painting, light in space. All the paintings, as you could sort of see in the image here, are painted with fluorescence in the back. So the painting is lifted, and that pink glow you see is actually a reflection of the painting behind the painting. So I was using a lot of these formal strategies that were based in contemporary and recent contemporary history. So, and then trying to bring in some identifying, culturally identifying elements that then start to talk about where my identity was rooted and how, especially in this early work, how we've dismissed ornament entirely as a craft language. And by dismissing ornament and dismissing craft, and all these works were made on paper, and I had conversations with a lot of the people you mentioned in LA saying, oh, you cannot make works on paper because these are not paintings, you know? So there were all these rigid structures around which one could make work, and they were set in a kind of commercial and patriarchal and, you know, within a specific canon of painting. And, but I knew that that was very important to me. In fact, you know, like, maybe stereotypically Egyptian of me, I was like, the more people said don't do it, I felt like I had to. And so I said, no, you know, the reason I use paper and the reason I use ornament is those are spaces that have been neglected historically. And who lives in those spaces? Non-Western, you know, cultural history, non-Western art, women, people of color, all of my heroes have lived in that space, and all of my history is contained in that space. So there's politics in this kind of decoration and ornamentation. And so, so then I brought those two elements together just to see how they were going to work, and to put them sometimes in concert and sometimes in opposition in the same single sheet of paper, to try to use abstract painting and abstract notions to maybe just as a metaphor of this moment in time where we were trying to figure out the politics of where we sat here in the US.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shireen. And for the viewers, you know, when you see that in person, the beautiful and delicate mashrabiya that we see, you know, the mashrabiya formed on the painting. And you've Shireen, you've worked with this concept of public-private, that mashrabiya also architecturally, and you drew parallels in your work as well on this public and private space and how it is negotiated architecturally, but even you drew parallel to the dress, to the veil, and how, you know, that is a space that is negotiated mostly for women, absolutely, and you did that in bigger installations. And that is beautifully communicated in the work as well.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so and that you see that when you see the painting in person, because in some spaces, all the information is, you know, removed when I cut the paper, but there's information behind the painting. There's shadows, there's light reflection, and so it's always about accessing that history that you can't quite immediately express, and the parallel with that architectural threshold is really important. And I think it does get developed later on in a lot of the sculptural works as well.
Thank you. From there, I am going to segue to Sama. And Sama, from Shireen's mashrabiyas and other ornamentations and the architectural form, I'd like to move to you, where we also find in one of your carryover photography series that we have in the show, how you also playfully feature the mashrabiyya, but perhaps a little bit differently, the mashrabiyya turning as a cage or a prison over the head of the woman protagonist, which I may add is you, in that. So we are going to pull up the series that we have in the show, and I will ask you to take us through it, and from there take us a little bit more broadly to your practice and the themes that it is grounded in. So over to you, Sama.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate this opportunity to talk, and it's so wonderful to be with all the panelists, and Maymanah especially, who I think I have in one way or another collaborated, worked with. Has it been since 2006 or 2007? It's been a really long time. We've done many projects together, so it's exciting to be here with you today. And so you're seeing right now two works that are, there's 4 works in this exhibition from my project, Carry Over. And Carry Over is made in 3 processes, 3 mediums. What is at this exhibition is the photogravures. And that is a traditional printmaking method of intaglio, and it's also has embossment on the edges of the work, which I will get into a little bit. And the image we just described, Lynn, is there on the right, Shisha 2. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not that one. It's Mashrabiyya, but that's not up
it's
on the
coming.
Not up. Okay. Well, I guess I won't talk about Mashrabiyya until it's up there, but maybe just give a little bit more broadly about the work and the project, which for me was reflecting. I wanted to reflect the legacy of colonial era photography made by Europeans in this Orientalist period, and the photographs they made in the Middle East and North Africa. And I was really interested in this particular period because I've been making work about the representation of Middle Eastern women. And that's just a shorthand. It could be a little bit more complex with Middle Eastern, North African women for a long time, and how they're represented in the West, especially in the United States. And I wanted to trace back where that representation comes from, and how could such crude, flattened depictions of women really say something about who we are and the complexities of women from the region, which are not monolithic, come from different countries, different experiences, different social classes, different religions, faiths, and how it sort of all gets tied down to this sort of singular obsession with veiling in the hijab as to describe our social and our social condition. So I wanted to look at this image history as primarily having my roots in photography and where that came from. And so no matter what I was doing as work as an artist in the United States, I would always have to be answered to this question about, since I do use my body often, why I may or may not be veiled in any particular photograph, or why I might be wearing Western clothes or tank tops, and then another one, maybe an ethnic costume. So I decided to just really lean into this whole research and unpack it through this particular project. And so it's really important to recognize that in photography's history, its invention and its rise, it coincides with European imperialism on a global scale. And so what you find in different eras of photography, that the print methods or the technologies shift everywhere pretty much in the Western world, except for these places where, such as the Middle East and North Africa and other colonized spaces, where photography really stayed in the print methods of albumin and photogravures, which had, even in its time, a kind of quality of being distant and past and nostalgic and old. And so it helped profoundly constructing this fantasy of a yesteryear, of something old and I don't know, gone. And so it really appealed to the European marketplace, because in this particular era, women's suffrage movement and labor movements were taking root. And so through my work, I've always primarily most of my work has this very strong Arab feminist perspective to the work. And so I think it's just really interesting that these photographs, the historical Orientalist photographs of this region, we're so caught up in the commercialization of this fantasy portal to the other. And you'd find these depictions, or you would find these objects that would be in all of these images. And we call that part of the scene making, this construction of that space of what would connote to be part of the Middle East, North Africa. So the water vessel over the head being carried was a very prominent one, the shisha, the hookah, the lounging female body, often veiled or with breast showing in the same image, the oriental carpet and ethnic costumes. And they're all part of these objects and these symbols that are supposed to create this space of the so-called fantasy space where women's bodies were sites for sexual freedom for men, right? In contrast to what was happening in Europe. So I wanted to pick up on that sort of absurdity and the burden of that representation over history and that legacy and how it extends into contemporary depictions of women of this region. And so throughout the project, you will find that gross exaggeration, the object at the scale of the body, still picking up on some of the motifs where the female body, as they are in most of those Orientalist images, they are centered framing, they're void of context, void of social context. They are, again, lounging, and it's sort of cataloging of who they are, but subverting and problematizing it by sort of having this, in a lot of the images, a very strong representation of the female figure, as you see in Water Bearer on the left, carrying the water vessel, but now the water vessel isn't just the sort of decorative holding, but a burden and a dysfunctional vessel, as it has a hole in it, and it's shaped as a kind of grenade or a wasp nest that kind of creates a tension to the piece. Or on the right, the very elongated, slightly shaped, it's a little bit hard to see in this slide, but if you see it in the real work, of the Nefertiti top of the crown, and then multiple hookah hoses coming out of it, right? To, again, point to that absurdity. And you probably could go to the next image if there's another one. And so the one on the left is Gamer. And that, I think, is what initiated the project. I was looking at in my research to do this project, seeing some old images, National Geographic, Life magazine type images that were, women in Iraq delivering the morning breakfast. So this is actually pretty true to like scale of what they would be carrying over their head, which was the morning breakfast being delivered out of the city by the milkmaids. And they would have a very Iraqi dish called gamer. It would come from buffalo milk that we would have with our bread and syrup in the morning. And I was just sort of considering, again, like thinking about other projects I'm working on, how Iraqi women's bodies have really disappeared, their lives have disappeared from social space in the aftermath of the US-led war in Iraq. And this kind of labor and work disappearing for women. And opportunities, I mean, this is just a representation of all kinds of work that sort of becomes complicated for women to do now, when we were supposed to be, as United States, bringing a so-called democracy and improving women's rights, which was always this conflation of women's rights and really exploitation of US military extremism over there, and really how it actually destabilized Iraqi women's lives. And so I wanted to put that depiction out there. And then on the right, to go back to the Mashrabiyya, she is, again, in this, so the Mashrabiyya, for those of our guests who may not know, it's the Arabesque artist lattice work. That's the weaving of wood that you would find in front of homes in Egypt, in Palestine, in Iraq. And it's a really great practical architectural element in that it allows air to circulate into the homes. It allows homes that are in the urban center to have some some access to the street, but not having their privacy revealed. But it's always being called in the West this idea of the harem window. So it's this portal to this fantasy of the unseen. What are you imagining behind that mashrabiya? And I'm considering that also, that kind of that scholarship about the imagining of what's behind the veil, and why does this create such a tension for Western viewers. But in my box that I've constructed, where her head becomes part of the shisha, the hookah, she becomes part of this cage. The lattice work is actually cutouts shaped in razor wire, and so it implicates real Arab issues that exist in parts of our region, especially regions for where I'm from, Palestinian and Iraqi, where people's lives are not really seen, hidden and trapped behind war zones and occupation, while the West is obsessed about this hijab issue. So that's sort of the playing of the lounging body goes back to these Orientalist images. And then again, on the periphery, that all of that, it's hard to see in these images, but what it is an embossing, a debossing. And it comes from tile work that I photographed in the Great Mosque of Quriran in Tunisia. And I was the first and only person who ever was able to photograph in that space. And they had to let me photograph because I was working with the researcher writing about them. And so I was allowed and accessed all these spaces in the mosque, traditionally in the that women can't access. And I think that's a story, a migration story, because those tiles did come from Iraq to Quriran. They're hand painted. My body came from the United States to there to photograph it. And yes, it's a feminist moment because I was able to do something in that space that's traditionally not allowed for women to do. And so it makes it onto my work, also referencing the ornament, the decorative, as Sherin had talked about, the albumins, the photogravures, the paper print, and to celebrate non-Western ways of working while still having very contemporary ideas in the work.
Thank you so much, Sama, for sharing the rich, the many layers that we can look at and discover in your work. Such richness, and from there, I'm going to turn to Jacqueline Reem. Jacqueline, you have two objects and a print in the show, and your work draws from your Palestinian and Syrian roots and the encounters you have had back home. Your work is pop infused at first glance as well. It looks colorful and happy. And then the viewer starts discovering the layers of complexities, the opposite, the contradictions, the chaos, and sometimes the violence that permeates. So tell us about those specific pieces that you have in the show, the stories behind them, and maybe just very quickly zoom out to tell us about your broader practice and what drives it.
First of all, thanks for having me be part of the show and this talk, and I'm really honored to be with these amazing artists. So the series of works were inspired by Sumaya Yusuf's memories of growing up in Fawar refugee camp and her attempts at creating a sense of normalcy while living under military occupation and through war. Her memories were first documented on video. I always like to capture the oral history, and that comes from actually something I have regrets about and has impacted my work through since I was like a teenager. My grandfather, who was a political, very politically active in Palestine, has an incredible history, and I decided to document him through. Back then, there wasn't like videotapes, video cameras as accessible as they are now, So I just tape recorded him on a cassette tape, and after he passed away, I was so regretful. And I was able to capture his oral history before he passed on cassette tapes and not even using like a good microphone. And I used to have dreams about it later, like that he was still alive, and I got him on videotape. And it was because his history in Palestine was so incredible and fascinating. And I was so upset with myself that I didn't take those steps to document him in a better way. So that sort of impacted my work then on. And I know so many people, like my husband, whose grandfather also had this incredible story, and he didn't document him at all. Like he said, I regret so deeply that I didn't even ask him enough questions. So that has a profound effect on my work. So I always seem to want to document everybody's story now on the basic, in the basic way through film and video. And then I like to play around and see how I can take those memories and oral histories and transform them into pieces of either art or video or and so with these pieces, as you see the cake, it's called Sana Helwa Ya Ukhti, and which means happy birthday, dear sister. So this piece is on my favorite memory from Sumaya. And so she grew up in Fawad refugee camp, and during the 67 war, and because of the dispiriting situation there, nobody celebrated holidays or birthdays. And one day, Sumaya, when she was 14 years old, her and her sister were like, we don't even know when our birthdays are. So they found their birth certificates, and her sister's birthday was the next day. And they were so excited. And Sumaya was she's incredible. She was like, you know what? I don't care that we're not allowed to celebrate. I'm going to invite all our friends. And she baked her a cake, and she even remembers the details of how she made this vanilla cake and invited all her friends. And that broke the taboo of celebration in the camp. And she impacted the future of that camp. They all started celebrating after that. They all started having birthdays and holidays. And I thought that was just an incredible moment that should be documented and preserved. And so until this day, also her sister, whenever she has her birthday, reminisces about that time. It was such an impactful moment for them. So I created this cake. On the outside, it looks like a normal cake that any kid would have, but when you slice into it, it reveals the systematic violence that she endured during her childhood in the camp. And the next piece, the collage piece, I think. Yes, so this is called Remembering the Future. And this is also based on Sumaya's earliest memories, which were the 67 war, which had a very dramatic effect on her life. She was 5 years old when the war happened, and amazingly, she remembers incredible details from that time period. And so I was just curious to see what was happening in New York at that time, because New York ended up being her future home. Later, she immigrated to New York. And I ran across this pretty interesting story that I didn't know existed. And so I thought it would be interesting to see those worlds collide. So during the 1964-65 World's Fair, took place in New York City. The fair's theme, ironically, was Peace Through Understanding, and dedicated to a man's achievement on a shrinking globe and expanding universe. That was their title. Jordan, there were pavilions from all countries. Jordan was the only representation from the Arab world. And in their pavilion on the way out at the exit, they had a huge mural with a Palestinian woman holding her child and a poem engraved into it, which talked about the Palestinian refugee cause. And so what was even then, it's pretty amazing. There was a quick attack and effect and protests, counter protests, attacks publicly. They tried the Zionists. There was an Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-American pavilion there, and they took as actions in any way they could to try to bring down this mural. And this is before the '67 war. So, so they sort of like popped this utopian, futuristic bubble that, the fair likes to present. And ironically, the Jordanian pavilion foresaw the future. And it wasn't a time of peace or understanding, it was the '67 war. Which resulted in the further displacements of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians. So in the imagery you see there, you'll see it's hard to see from from far, but there is the mural. I found an image of the mural, and it's in there. And a lot of the imagery is from the pavilion itself, and also playing off of Sumayya's memories of the '67 war. Like her father was the first to have a television set and he was the first to bring electricity to the camp, which was incredible. He brought a generator and he brought a TV, and the people in the camp would come and watch Kulthum, and that's one of her vivid memories, was like hearing the bombs drop, but being drowned out by the sounds of Kulthum. And so there she's representing sort of like a Godzilla-esque stature, stopping the airplanes, the military jets, from attacking the camp. So it just combines a bunch of her strongest memories and plays on Palestinian agency so they're actively challenging and undermining the fair is naive narrative of the future.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. And then the next. So Maftulia is a doll made from maftul, which is a Palestinian couscous. And so Sumayya spent much of her childhood playing with friends and her happy memories. So this doll is based on her happy memories of collecting scraps and creating dolls. And also it's kind of an ode to the creativity of children and how they can how they deal with trauma and through creativity. So this doll is a combination of her happy memories. One is like of running through the wheat fields that glistened like gold. She said she would pretend she was in a golden castle and running away from, she was always trying to escape her reality. She loved like anything that took her away from the surrounding occupation. So the doll is dedicated to that.
Thank you, Jacqueline, Reem, for sharing. And I want to go on and peel some of the things that have come up in our first conversation here. You all spoke about the two worlds, multiple worlds. Jacqueline, Reem, you spoke about them colliding. I want us to discuss a bit more in depth this topic of being in this in-between space, producing work in the US, straddling different cultures, how this has played out for each of you. I want to go back to you, Maymanah, and ask you that you ground us a bit more in this topic. What, in your view, has characterized the Arab American or Arab diaspora artist experiences in the US? If we can, if you can tease out some things that you've come across in your research, what have been or still are also the main challenges? How is it any different for any other diaspora in the US, and why?
Part of the reason why I was saying earlier that I think that Arab American artists are very much part of that American art historical canon is that there have been different ethnic communities whose artists have had to take on very similar roles. And I think that one of the biggest things, especially that we can see as a thread between the three artists that are speaking today, is the fact that there's a very, very strong level of commitment in the work, and there's a very strong sense of advocacy in terms of correcting narratives, in terms of pushing back against narratives, in terms of really kind of asserting oneself and one's identity and one's experience, and really kind of addressing the fact that so often we're either hyper visible or invisible. So I think that maybe that's the most intense form of in-betweenness, in the sense that we are a persecuted community in this country, and then also back home, in terms of what the issues that that Jacqueline has brought up and that Maymanah has brought up. So I think that that sense of in-betweenness is on multiple sort of registers. It's not just a sense of like, oh, my identity is here, my identity is there. It's a matter of having to navigate the intensity of being an Arab in the US at a time when the US has just continually attacked the region.
Absolutely. I want to turn to the artist as well with this conversation, and maybe start with you, Shireen. How has this sort of, you spoke about this a bit, you touched upon it as you are sort of diving into your work and describing the moment where you wanted, you felt that you gave yourself permission to actually use those things that really come from home, right? To sort of merge them and express yourself. But how has this back and forth from Egypt to the US, the relocation to the US, you say somewhere also the loss of your home in Egypt. How have these impacted your work? What were turning points for you that you feel might have shaped your work, and this sort of triggered that sort of, those two worlds colliding, that layering, that juxtaposition, or any other sort of, development in your work? How do you think that has played out for you?
Well, I think what Maymanah just mentioned is really kind of present in the work, which is, growing up Coptic, growing up a woman in Egypt, there was an othering that was happening there. And then coming to the US, there was this ideal of then just becoming American, and in my, 13-year-old naive brain, that was going to be a kind of inclusive environment, which of course we know is not quite that whatsoever. And around the same time, the war on Iraq and 9/11 and the images that were then all of a sudden being represented of the Middle East were nothing that I recognized from home. So in a way, it helped me advocate for myself and for my, it helped me re-identify and reconnect with a place that I had felt already alienated from. And that space that I was occupying at the time was not feeling home or welcome neither in the Savannah region nor here in the US. And so I think that moment of like getting those images on CNN constantly, in the newspaper constantly, on the internet, that of just bombs, and from, it was just a time that I felt like I had to redirect my position as an artist, because I felt like not just permission, but also responsibility to write a different narrative and to show a different element. Also, Sama, when you were talking about the way women were represented to the West from the Savannah region, it dismisses the fact that there is a very long, extensive history of feminism in the Salloum region, huge and parallel to and at the same time as it was happening in Europe and in the US. And I think in sometimes in deeper rooted ways. And so there were a lot of women that were leading feminist movements that were just, again, invisible. And I realized I didn't know who they were, so I think that it was just a moment of self-reflection and kind of trying to know, like, trying to figure out where I felt I had to be rooted, and realizing that doesn't also exist, right? There's not an official record, or there's not anything in the history books, neither here nor in Egypt, that actually identify things that, cultural relationships and social structures that I felt empowered by. But I knew they existed because you see glimpses of them in history books, somebody had given me, History of Egypt, and it was like this thick, like the 4-inch one, and I was looking, immediately I go to the glossary, to the index. I was like, okay, let's see how many Egyptian feminists are listed here, right? And Durrey Shafi and Huda Sha'rawi are listed twice, each with one sentence, in the entire history of modern Egypt. And we're not talking about pharaonic times, we're talking about modern Egyptian history, in these canonical books. And so, what I found I had to do, and I see some parallel here with the other artists, is that we're having to create that history. Some of it is archival, like Jacqueline, your work is archival and through historical record, and some you're recreating it. So we're fictionizing it, we're recreating it, we're creating these fantasies as you described, because we have to kind of make the context from which we've come to be in the US as Arab artists, as Sawana artists. So I think that moment, like I said, was just being bombarded by a reflection of my identity that didn't hold true. So I had to figure out how to replace that with something that felt more real to my experience.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shireen. And that's a great segue. Sama, I want to go to you. You also articulate issues of feminism, of course, but your work is also rooted in war and exile and the impact of that on societies and on women. And you and your family have had to move several times to relocate to different places amidst situations of sort of conflict, war, and whatnot. And you settled in the US as a young teenager. How hard was it for you to find your voice and establish yourself as an artist when you're up against such, dominant narratives that Shireen is referring to? When did you feel, was there a trigger where you were able to find your voice, or you were able to contextualize what you wanted to do here in the US?
Yes. Again, we came, when I was a teenager, and it was complex because it wasn't even that I could come here and assimilate. It was very difficult because we came here legally, but then we became undocumented very quickly. And so I'm very out in public about this now, this process of what happens to people when they lose a homeland, right? And ours is multiple generations because it traces back to my mother's family losing Palestine. The part of Palestine they're from is now Israel. And so they were displaced to Iraq. And then she married an Iraqi, and then they were displaced again and exiled, and we were blacklisted from coming back. And so it just wound up being a story of migration, just moving to different countries, and every time losing the work visa because of the pressure Iraq was putting on those Arab countries to not renew the work visas of those who were obliged to work for Iraq. And so it's like this uprootedness is not just a condition of longing for a home or homeland, or even a homeland you barely remember as a child or you have connections to, but it was something that as a Palestinian, even before the Iraq uprootedness started, it was already something I was raised with, that narrative, that fissure and trauma of losing homeland, and that passing and that compounding. And so when I actually wound up in the United States, in a relatively safe place, it was really hard for a long time to identify with being in the US because of being undocumented and hiding that information and having to live in the shadows of whatever I was trying to do, right? Trying to survive without being found out or having anybody in my family found out. And so when you think about being a young person and all the social injustice that you're seeing on the news, and as the Palestinian liberation struggles or the ongoing embargo of Iraq, which was just devastating the people, led by US sanctions, I could say things, but I could only do so much. I couldn't go out into the streets and protest. And then so the first Gulf War, when Iraq was set up basically to invade Kuwait, and then the United States invaded Iraq, there was always these wanting and desire to engage, but I couldn't engage anything publicly, only with just talking about it with my friends. And so this need for photography or a way, in my naive, idealistic young brain at that time, I thought, it's probably because I don't have someone that understands how to straddle between these places. And I would, if I just go study photography and I become a war journalist and I'm stationed there, I'll be able. And then, of course, once I started studying photography, I realized that was never going to work, right? That idealization that you could actually impact something and work for a Western newspaper and get this is far beyond this construction me. It was hyper. And also you have to understand that at this age, there was no internet. So I couldn't just get on a social media and create my own platform. I mean, whatever the dominant platforms that were there, they were there, right? The news and whatever was coming out. And so there was not a lot of access points for me as a young person in the United States, except for my personal experience and some lefty magazine and Edward Said and whatever. And so, it was hard to figure that out. And by the time 9/11 happened, it was a year and a half after I graduated from undergrad in photography, not really knowing how to make work about the Middle East, knowing I was not going to be a war photojournalist. But 9/11 really framed things in my head. And it was kind of overnight that I realized, especially as there was this sort of fear in the United States of our community to somehow apologize for something that we didn't construct, and a complete divorce of context of all the other wars that the United States was doing in that region. And this, as Sherin talks about this, invisible, visible, we were always here, but suddenly now we're this hyper visibility, and somehow I'm supposed to be, talking about, I'm supposed to be somehow apologizing for people that are not from my country, yet my country's about to get invaded, right? Again, and none of those hijackers were even on the plane. So it was just so nonsensical. But this time I had a green card. I wasn't yet an American citizen, but I did go to graduate school, and I started on my work. And I think of this thing that Mona Hatoum talks about in her video, really early video work called Measures of Distance, this crisis of identity. Then she's going back and negotiating with her mother, reading the letters of her mother from these questions. And this crisis of identity started very young for me, because I was raised with that narrative of losing Palestine. And then Palestine is not even a real place anymore. It's a real place, but none of our family could access it. So my citizenship when I became an American citizen in 2004, I just started going to Palestine, and that resolved a lot of my crisis of identity, because I had a living, real relationship with Palestine that I developed, that I was able to trace back some roots. I was able to find my grandmother's home. My grandmother's home was demolished. I was able to reconnect in another kind of way, but still I will never be able to be Palestinian in that kind of way, or Iraqi in the way that I was when I was young. And I cannot, it is complex to understand what being American is, but I actually agree with Maymanah that these are all American stories, and these are all American context. And at the same time, I also say that these are also Middle Eastern, North African, but especially Middle Eastern contexts, because and identities, that this is a 21st century identity now, to be, maybe it's not a hyphen, maybe it is, maybe it's a hybrid, maybe it's not, maybe we're refugees. I don't really know what the word is, but there's so many of us living in this crisis that I want to strip away the crisis and say, this is a new category of being Middle Eastern in this era. And that's what I am moving toward as an artist and as a human being.
Thank you, Sama, fascinating. I want to go to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, your work also focuses on challenging the stereotypes of Arabs in the media. And your work is also the basis of a youth education program on Palestine. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that helps you deal with this in-betweenness, right? Here in the US and otherwise.
Yeah, so growing up as a first generation Arab American, my mom is from Palestine and my dad is from Syria. I, like many Arab Americans, grew up not being proud of who we are because of the impact of the media, Hollywood films. I never saw any positive depiction of us growing up. I think things are changing a lot now, which is amazing, with social media and having more filmmakers and producers. And something when I was growing up, it really was a very small handful of people working in the field of art and music and film. And as a kid, I all I saw were negative things. And so of course that has an impact on you and wanting to hide who you are. But because I come from a family that is so rooted in their history, and I always had my mom, when we'd watch the news, correct it and be like, like, what hypocrisy, look at this, they're going after this country, and then meanwhile they're supporting that, so I grew up with always having that voice behind me, educating me. And then of course my grandparents, my grandfather, who I mentioned before, he had a huge impact on my life because he refused to go back to Palestine. We actually got him a ticket to go back, I remember, for his birthday when I was younger. And he refused to go because he said, I can't go back to my land when it's occupied. He just couldn't handle it. I saw the effects of a man who had such responsibilities there. And then when he came to the US, he worked in a photo supply store, but he would still wear his suit every day in a tie and look amazing. And even when we come visit him, so there was that sense of pride of who he was. And it was very painful to see that it was painful to witness him aging and not being able to go back home. And so anyway, that had a great effect on my work. And then I wanted to challenge the stereotype. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. So in my work, I discovered Jack Shaheen's book called Real Bad Arabs, where he documents over 1,000 films. This is before 9/11. And out of the 1,000 films, only 12 were positive, and 20 were even-handed. And I thought, I need to do something with this information. This was back in 2003 after 9/11.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up a bit.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. So I created Planet of the Arabs, which challenges the stereotypes, and I used pop infused methods to make it more palatable for people. And so that ended up and I made a documentary film on the Palestinian hip hop scene, and those kind of things were used in educational programs that you brought up, because I think just the palatability of Hollywood and hip hop can easily transform into educational tools.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take everything that you said, and I'm going to just turn our last frame very quickly into a question that I think some people have as well. Looking ahead, how can we move forward beyond this separation, categorization? What needs to happen so that this beautiful and rich cultural hybridity that you all are talking about, that you all have, can be used as a way to bind and explore rather than separate? 30 minutes each person. Maymanah, can you start with this? What do curators, cultural institutions, museums, what needs to happen so that we see more inclusivity?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting time to be working in the American art scene, because there are broader discussions about decolonization, and kind of unpacking what American history is, what it was founded on, and how we are on occupied land and how we are all settler colonials. So I think that within those conversations, this idea of the neglect that's been taking place over the past 100 years of Arab and Arab American artists in this country, I think that that should be folded in. I think it's a matter of advocacy in the sense of there need to be more people, there need to be more scholars, more art historians, and those kinds of things happen within the community itself. I mean, we as community members need to encourage our children to go into the arts as opposed to discouraging them, to really kind of understand that the arts are very powerful, that the arts are about agency and about beauty and aesthetics and politics and all of these wonderful sort of things. I think there needs to be more encouragement from our side, but then I also think that institutions really need to take a hard look at their histories and their institutional cultures and really start to think, okay, what have we neglected? What have we made invisible, right? What have we rendered invisible? How are we still stuck in this settler colonial mentality? How can we reconcile that? How can we fix it? So I think it's a conversation that's really beyond our community specifically, and it's a larger sort of American discussion that's taking place, but it needs to be picked up in terms of the pace. And
thank you. And I'm going to stay on that topic and turn Ria Haddad's question to the artist, which is rooted a bit into what we're discussing. How do you think artists can break from this richness that you've described more into the mainstream in the US? Shireen, I'm going to go to you. How do you think this can happen? Is it about access? Is it about agency? What is it about?
I don't, I was looking at that question. I don't feel like I'm outside the mainstream in that way. I just don't. I mean, I think I just had to reframe for myself who I understood my audience to be, so I understand that my audience is more diverse than people who go to art institutions, so I do a lot of public art. I do interviews, I do work, I do, public engagement projects outside of just a kind of institutionalized vision of what Arab artists are supposed to do. So I think for me, it had to start with me understanding who I was, who my audience is, and that, again, Maymanah, you said it so well. It's just this is a moment where we're looking at what identifies us as Americans, not as Arab Americans. So when as we're redefining this identity of what it means to be American, we are in the mainstream. And so I think it's up to us to claim that space, and occupy that space and understand that our audience is not just, museum going people, but it's also kids that are looking at our, we have a 10-year-old on this call, that are listening and waiting to use the research that we're doing in our work and in our writing, and to kind of formulate their identities as Americans, and as Arab Americans, as Swan Americans. So I think it's a matter of claiming it, and occupying it, and not allowing the kind of box to exist too much. I really, like we were talking about again in Gia's question, is like not allowing this question of craft or visually specific cultural paradigms to close us in, but to open up the conversation more.
Absolutely. 20 seconds, Sama, and then Jacqueline on this. Before we wrap up, thank you for Hannah for joining us. If you have questions about your essay, email us. We will respond to you. Sama and then Jacqueline, 20 seconds before we wrap up. You're muted, Sama.
I agree with Maymanah that it's an exciting moment because of the decolonization movement. My part is I'm also a professor on top of being an artist, and so it's not that I haven't been teaching a de-Western, non-Western centered canon for a long time anyway, but it's just made me a lot more bold about how I can claim and talk and speak in all of these panels. And when the opportunities to arise, I was in a big summit meeting with photography curators this past year, and I really insisted that these things that we are talking about, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, these are our experiences here, are American stories, and we cannot. How could we have spent $3 trillion, United States, in Iraq if this was not an American story? And so, just insisting and actually putting it back on them. What are they going to do?
Absolutely, thank you, Jacqueline.
Well, I think everyone covered.
Comments. Yeah.
I think everyone covered it. I agree with everything everyone said. I think the impact on the younger generation is important. And I do, like, we come from a culture where majoring in art or film is not very acceptable. You know, when I told my parents I was going to major in art, they were like, no, be a pharmacist, be a librarian, you know, like all these ridiculous things that weren't me. And I did, one thing that made me happy was when I was touring with my film, Slingshot Hip Hop, I had a lot of parents come up to me with their children who said, they want to, because I would always lecture the parents after. I'm like, stop telling your kids to be a doctor and a pharmacist, let them go to film. We need more filmmakers. We need more people in media and film and producers. So yeah, I think that.
Thank you. All good things come to an end. And I'm going to hand over. I want to thank you for sharing so thoughtfully and so honestly today and generously. And I'm going to hand it over to Kate to close. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, ladies, for that incredibly interesting conversation. It'll be on the record for everyone to read. I want to turn it into something. You've really enriched my and the audience's understanding of your artwork and of your practice. Thank you, Maymanah, for the show. It's just lovely. Once again, it's up through November 17th. Send your friends, send your acquaintances. We're open this Saturday night. From 6 p.m. to midnight, a great chance to come see it for the audiences who are here in Washington. And please look out for more panels around